Welcome to our deep dive all about the RMS Titanic. You want to learn more about this legendary ship. And we've got some cool sources lined up to help us out. We're looking at excerpts from the Royal Museum's Greenwich website and also checking out the Titanic's Wikipedia page. Really trying to dig up the facts, maybe even bust a few myths along the way. Today, we're going to separate facts from fiction and understand the impact of this ship. I mean, it still fascinates us over a century later.
It really is interesting. The Titanic wasn't just some ship. It was like a symbol of its time. Back in 1912, a brand new century. Technology was just exploding. Everyone felt this sense of possibility. And the Titanic kind of captured all that. The biggest ship ever built, a total feat of engineering, and of course, a floating palace.
I've always been curious about that whole floating palace thing. What made it so luxurious?
Well, the Titanic was designed to feel like a fancy hotel, more like the Ritz than a ship, really. First-class passengers, they could enjoy a gym, a swimming pool, Turkish baths, even a squash court.
A squash court on a ship. That's crazy.
And that wasn't all. There was this grand dining saloon, a bunch of other dining options, and even a little French-style cafe called the Café Parisien. They really wanted passengers to forget they were even at sea.
It's kind of amazing to think about how big this thing was. Where do they even build a ship this massive?
Well, they built it at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast,
Right.
just to give you an idea how big this project was. They had to demolish the old slipways, and they built this huge gantry, the biggest the world had ever seen, just to start work.
Okay, hold on. What's a gantry?
Think of it like a giant steel frame towering over the ship as it's being built. This one was enormous, so workers could move these massive parts of the ship and put in millions of rivets.
Millions. That's nuts. I can't even imagine how long that took.
Oh, it was a super complex process, and unfortunately not a safe one either. Working conditions in shipyards back then were rough. Safety, minimal accidents all the time.
Yeah, the sources mention over 240 injuries and, sadly, 8 deaths during the Titanic's construction.
It's a real reminder of the human cost behind these huge engineering projects. But the Titanic was more than just a construction project. It was packed with the latest tech, like the propulsion system, for instance. They used 2 reciprocating steam engines and a low-pressure turbine.
Why 3 engines? Was that normal back then?
Not really, no, but it was pretty smart. The reciprocating engines were powerful, but they could be inefficient. And they caused vibrations, so they added the turbine to be more efficient. And it smoothed out the ride.
So they were basically mixing different technologies for a smoother, more comfortable trip.
Exactly.
Clever. What else was so innovative about the Titanic?
Well, they're the watertight compartments. They were designed to keep the ship afloat, even if part of the hull got damaged. They also had these remotely activated watertight doors that could seal off different parts of the ship in an emergency. And get this, they even had a Marconi wireless communication system, one of the most powerful in the world at the time.
Wow, wireless communication in 1912. That's way ahead of its time.
Oh, it was cutting edge. Their system could send messages for hundreds of miles. It was key for staying connected with the world and getting important info, like iceberg warnings.
Ah, yes, the famous iceberg warnings. Didn't the Titanic get a bunch of those before the disaster?
They did, but not all of them were taken as seriously as they should have been. There was definitely some pride, maybe even overconfidence, in the Titanic's fancy safety features.
I'm also reading about a national coal strike in the UK at the time. Does that affect the Titanic's maiden voyage?
Oh yeah, definitely. The strike caused tons of problems, and a lot of passengers had to delay their trips. The Titanic actually left with a lot of empty cabins. They had to move coal from other ships. They even used some coal from the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, just to leave on time.
It's wild how something like a coal strike could have such a big impact. Do you think the pressure to stick to the schedule, even with the strike, could have affected how they handled the iceberg warnings?
That's a question historians have debated for years. It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely possible. The Titanic was a symbol of national pride. There was a lot of pressure for the maiden voyage to be a success.
It's like this domino effect, one event leading to another. Speaking of the maiden voyage, it started on April 10th, 1912, from Southampton, with stops in Cherbourg and Queenstown. But before it even left Southampton, there was a near collision.
You're right. As the Titanic was leaving the docks, it was so big, and it pushed so much water out of the way that another ship, the SS City of New York, started rocking back and forth like crazy. The mooring cables on the City of New York actually snapped, and it started drifting towards the Titanic.
No way, that's scary. Did they avoid hitting each other?
Thankfully, yes. A tugboat captain thought fast, and Captain Smith on the Titanic steered really well. They missed each other by just a few feet.
That's way too close. Makes you wonder if that was a sign, like a bad omen.
It's an interesting thought, even with that close call. The Titanic still had a huge challenge ahead. The vast Atlantic Ocean and the hidden danger of icebergs.
So the Titanic sets off, this huge journey, full of passengers from all over, a symbol of luxury and progress. Some pretty important people were on board too, huh?
Yeah, for sure. J. Bruce Ismay was there. He was the managing director of the White Star Line. He was super excited to see his vision come to life. And of course, Thomas Andrews was on board, the ship's designer. He was ready to see how the Titanic performed firsthand.
It's kind of poetic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Both of these guys. So invested in this amazing ship, sailing towards, well,
Yeah. It's that human element that makes the Titanic story so powerful, even after all these years. It reminds us that even with incredible technology, it's the human stories that really matter.
Totally. So let's talk about that night, April 14th, 1912. What was the weather like?
It had actually calmed down. After a few rough days, it was a clear night, stars were out, but it was freezing. The sea was really calm, almost too calm.
It's always given me chills, this peaceful setting, right before disaster, like nature was tricking them.
It's a haunting image. Makes the events that followed even more tragic. The Titanic was still going pretty fast, even though they got those iceberg warnings from other ships.
Wait, they knew about the icebergs, and they didn't slow down. Why?
That's the million-dollar question. Historians have been trying to figure that out for over a century. It seems like a few things happened. Everyone thought the Titanic was the safest ship ever. Maybe they were overconfident. Plus, there were probably some communication problems, and maybe they just didn't realize the danger.
It's hard to believe they didn't slow down. In an area with icebergs. Anything else going on?
Well, remember the coal strike? Some historians think they were trying to stay on schedule. Even with the strike and having to get coal from other places,
Yeah.
that might have played a role.
So they might have been pushing it a little to catch up.
Could be. It adds another layer to the whole story. Shows how pressure and stuff can lead to bad decisions.
Even with the best intentions. And then at 11:40 p.m., look out, Frederick Fleet. He sees it.
Right in front of them. Almost no time to react.
I bet they panicked.
First Officer William Murdoch, he ordered the ship to turn, but the Titanic was just too big. And going too fast, they couldn't avoid it.
And then the unsinkable ship hits an iceberg. It's almost hard to believe.
I know, right? And the impact itself wasn't even that dramatic. But the damage was done, the iceberg scraped along the side, ripped up in some compartments below the waterline.
I always thought they hit head on, not just a scrape.
Yeah, that's a common mistake. But even that scrape was enough. 5 compartments flooded right away, a 6th started filling up.
And that's when the unsinkable part sank, was their panic.
At first, people were confused. They didn't know how bad it was, but then, yeah, panic.
Okay, this has always bugged me. If the Titanic was so advanced, why not enough lifeboats for everyone?
Good question. Back then, people didn't really think ships would sink completely. Lifeboats were for moving passengers to a rescue ship, not for everyone to escape.
So they never imagined the whole ship going down.
Right. The Titanic had more lifeboats than the rules required, but still not enough. It shows that sometimes. Our text gets ahead of our safety rules.
So they felt safe because the Titanic was fancy. But then not enough lifeboats.
Yeah, that's...
What happened when they were evacuating?
Chaos. The crew didn't have enough training for something like this. They didn't even know how many people fit in each lifeboat. So some left half empty.
So even the lifeboats they had weren't used right.
It's a tragedy.
And then there's women and children first. I get it. But it must have been awful for families.
It was a terrible situation. The rule was meant to save people, but yeah, it caused a lot of pain. The sources say almost all women and children in first and second class survived, but third class, not so much.
Shows how unfair things were back then.
Yeah, and most of the men, passengers and crew, especially the lower classes, they died.
The water was freezing too. What happened to the people in the water?
They didn't last long. Hypothermia sets in fast. Only a few could hold on to stuff or find space on a lifeboat.
I can't imagine how scared they were.
It's a haunting image. The dark, the cold water, people screaming for help, and then silence under a calm, starry sky.
The wireless operators were sending messages, right? Did anyone hear them?
Oh, yeah. They were sending out calls like crazy, hoping someone would pick them up.
So people knew. Did anyone come?
There were ships out there, but none close enough to get there in time. The RMS Carpathia, they got the message and went as fast as they could, but they got there 3 hours later.
Too late for most people.
It was devastating. All they found were lifeboats and wreckage.
How many survived?
The Carpathia rescued 710 people.
But over 1,500 died. What a loss. What happened after? The whole world was shocked, right? The Titanic sinking, it wasn't just a shipwreck, it was like a global moment.
Yeah, for sure. The Titanic was supposed to be, the best of humanity, our ingenuity, all that progress, and then it sank. It made everyone rethink things. Like, what are the limits of technology? What about the power of nature? It was a reality check. Even the biggest, most impressive things we build can still be destroyed.
And people didn't just forget about it, right? The sources mention all these
Well,
investigations.
yeah, there was a huge outcry. People wanted answers. Someone had to be held responsible. The British and American governments, they both launched inquiries. They had to figure out why it happened.
And they found problems,
Yeah.
right? Like not enough lifeboats. And the crew wasn't trained well enough.
Exactly. Shipbuilding tech was advancing so fast. But the safety rules hadn't caught up. The Titanic sinking wasn't just a tragedy, it forced things to change.
And those changes made a difference, right? For safety at sea.
Huge difference. They came up with the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. In 1914, just a couple of years after the Titanic, it made a bunch of changes. Things we think are totally normal now.
Like what?
Well, now ships have to have enough lifeboats for everyone. Sounds obvious, but it wasn't back then. They made lifeboat drills mandatory. Ships had to have 247 wireless communication, and they started the International Ice Patrol to keep track of icebergs in the North Atlantic. All those changes came from what they learned from the Titanic.
It's pretty amazing how something so terrible could lead to so much good. The Titanic's at the bottom of the ocean. But its story's still with us. Why do you think that is? Why are we still so fascinated by it after all this time?
It's a lot of things, I think. The human stories are really powerful. The passengers, the crew, their dreams, their courage, their sacrifices, and the mystery, too. What happened? Exactly. There are still so many questions.
And it's not just the stories, it's the ship itself.
Right. The Titanic was huge, luxurious, cutting edge. It's hard not to be fascinated by it. This amazing ship that ended so suddenly.
The sources talk about museums and memorials
Mm.
all over the world.
Yeah, there's the Titanic Museum in Belfast, where they built it. It tells the story of the ship's construction, the workers who built it, the city where it all began.
And there's the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax.
They have artifacts from the wreck, pieces of the ship, people's belongings. It makes the story real. These were real people.
It's crazy that they're still finding stuff
Mhm.
over 100 years later.
Yeah, it shows how powerful the story is. And then there are all the books and movies. So many different perspectives on the Titanic.
That James Cameron movie from 1997, that introduced the Titanic to a whole new generation.
Totally. And that song.
It was everywhere.
But it's more than just pop culture. People are still doing serious research on the Titanic. New technology is helping us learn even more about the wreck and what happened.
Like that digital twin they made.
Right, a 3D model of the whole ship from pictures of the wreck, so detailed. It's helping researchers learn so much.
So after this deep dive, what's the biggest takeaway for you?
I'm struck by how the Titanic story keeps changing. It's not just history, it's still unfolding. Every new discovery, every new study, we understand it a little better.
And it makes us think about ourselves, too. Our good ideas and our bad ideas. How we handle risk and safety. How we sometimes underestimate nature.
That's a good point. So what about you? What stands out to you? What questions do you have now?
I'm thinking about how fragile life is. How quickly things can change. The Titanic was a triumph. But it also shows that we're all vulnerable, no matter how clever we are, or how big our dreams are.
That's a powerful thought. And it leads us to a final question. The Titanic sinking made ships safer. What other disasters have done the same thing? What can we learn from the past to build a safer future? Something to think about as we go about our lives.